It's good to see you. Thank you very much for having me.
So are we about to be in a forever war? Is that the goal here for these neocons and Democrats? I mean, let's put them all together. I mean, all of these corrupt people, they're all in it together, wanting to funnel $100 billion more into this machine. Or are we done? Are we going to walk away from this and say, wow, that was a huge mistake. Let's move on.
Neither. Let's just be dead straight up honest here. The Americans have no credibility. The Europeans have no credibility. The Ukrainians have no credibility. The only side that has credibility is Russia. Stop listening to anything. Look, I love Seymour Hersh. He's a close friend. We've been friends for 25 years. The source he's quoting, I can't say what I want to say about the source on your show because I would have to use some very foul language. Everybody's jumping on him saying, the words, oh, it's over, the army's destroyed. But look how he prefaces it. Putin was an idiot to go in. Putin did. So what he's saying is the source doesn't know anything about Russia. The source is as ignorant about Russia and about what's going on today as anybody else, that this is political spin. It's not an intelligence source by somebody who knows what's going on. It's an assessment by somebody who is changing their position because they bought into the nonsense early on that Putin's a thug, he was an idiot to invade, etc. That means you don't understand anything about the special military operation. And if you think this is going to be a frozen conflict, understand this. In order to be frozen, both sides have to agree to freeze. You know who's not going to freeze? Russia. Russia is winning this war. Russia will win this war, and this war will be won on the battlefield by terms set by Russia. I didn't just make that up. Sergei Lavrov basically threw those words back in the face of the Europeans. Because you remember back when they were cocky, back when they said, oh, we've got this stuff, Zelensky's going to launch a counteroffensive, they were saying, no negotiations, no negotiations. We're going to win this on the battlefield. And now everybody's saying, freeze it, have negotiations. The Russians are saying, no, we sort of agree with you last time. It's going to be one on the battlefield. And that's the way it's going to be. $100 billion more to freeze a conflict. Let's just make this clear. The conflict will not be frozen. That $100 billion, if it's expended, will be wasted because the Russians will chew through it like a hot knife through butter, just like they chewed through the $113 billion we've already poured into Ukraine. Is this war over? It's over as if, like the Second World War was, the war on the Eastern Front was over after Battle of Kursk. Everybody knows who's going to win this war. There's no one out there who can say, oh, Ukraine can turn this around. What they want is a frozen war. Why? Well, look at Lindsey Graham. It's the best investment we ever made, he said. We're spending all this money, only 5% of a defense budget, and we're killing Russians without any American boots on the ground, without any American body bags coming home. That's the kind of stuff that should put you in the docket in a court of law, found you guilty of conspiracy for mass murder and genocide, and hung by the neck until dead. Lindsey Graham should be kicked out of the Senate, and anybody who thinks like him should be kicked out of Congress because it's just stupid. The Russians had every right to initiate this action. The United States and NATO doubled down on stupid. The initial stupid was expanding NATO up to the Russian border, knowing that it would trigger a Russian military response. Having triggered the military response, we then opted to continue the fight, even though the Russians were working to get a negotiated termination of this conflict. I just need to remind your audience, had Zelensky signed the peace agreement that the Russians had on the table that would have ended this conflict on 1 April 2022, Zaporizhia would be Ukrainian. Kherson would be Ukrainian. The Donbass would probably be going through an internationally monitored referendum right now to determine what its future would be. 400,000 Ukrainian men would be alive. 20 million Ukrainian civilians would not have been kicked out of their home. An entire generation of Ukrainian children wouldn't be displaced, without fathers, without education, condemned to a future of despair because of that decision. That decision was a decision backed by the United States, promulgated by the United States, by the same people articulating in favor of a frozen conflict today. There will be no frozen conflict. Russia will not allow it to happen. Russia will continue to be in the business of demilitarizing the Ukrainian army. That means killing them. Let's just be frank what it means. They're going to slaughter them. They're going to wade into them. They're going to knock them down like wheat being knocked down by a scythe. This is going to get ugly, but the outcome is absolutely 100% guaranteed. Total Russian victory.
And yet, neocons in Washington are pushing for this idea of perhaps a frozen conflict, the idea we can fight them over there, we'll fight Russia over there so we don't have to use American men to do it, and we'll use Ukrainian men to do it. Bill Kristol over the weekend, I mean, this guy, went from being somewhat rational, becoming a total warmonger, and pushing for this idea of a protracted war. He tweeted out this video that's now gone viral. Last night it launched on television networks across the United States. It's a Republican advertisement. I'm just going to play it here and get our audience's response to it because it's just stunning. Watch.
When America arms Ukraine, we get a lot for a little. Putin is an enemy of America. We've used 5% of our defense budget to arm Ukraine, and with it, they've destroyed 50% of Putin's army. We've done all this by sending weapons from storage, not our troops. The more Ukraine weakens Russia, the more it also weakens Russia's closest ally, China. America needs to stand strong against our enemies. That's why Republicans in Congress must continue to support Ukraine.
So Anders Aslan then tweeted after this video was made public last night, said this is short but perfect, this video. By the U.S. giving Ukraine 5% of the U.S. military budget, the justification for us using this money, Ukraine destroyed 50% of the Russian military, he says. This is the most efficient use of military expenditures ever, and this is how they're justifying it. First of all, they've destroyed 50% of Russia's military?
I don't know. Look, Anders Aslan is a Swedish apologist who works for the Atlantic Council. His sole function, his DNA has been genetically altered so that all he does is spew anti-Russian nonsense. He's lost all credibility as an objective observer of the issues. And this endorsement of this ridiculous Republican video. Look, this war will end. Russia will win. That video will always be here to remind the American people of just how morally corrupt and bankrupt the Republican Party is, and Anders Aslan is. 50% of the Russian army, are they high? The Russian army has probably suffered about 50,000 dead. Maybe you could add a few thousand more. Maybe you could subtract a few thousand more. That's a lot of dead. Remember, it took us about 10 years in Vietnam to lose that many dead, and it's 600 days. 50,000 is a huge amount. It is painful for Russia, but it ain't 50% of the Russian military. The Russian military was 900,000 strong when this war began. They're going to pump up the active military to 1.5 million. They're in the process of doing that right now. In addition to that is the 300,000 mobilized reservists, 300,000 volunteers, and another 250,000 recently conscripted, turned into contract soldiers, in addition to the 200,000 they had. I mean, I'm not the greatest mathematician in the world, but I think I just articulated a case of well over 1 million people being dedicated to this special military operation, and they lost 50,000. Maybe Swedish math is different, but it's just stupidity beyond belief. But you know who has lost more than 50% of their military? The Ukrainians. They started this conflict with about 246,000 active duty forces, another 300,000 territorialists. Maybe you could throw in another 200,000 border guards and internal troops. 400,000 dead, which means that probably another over 1 million wounded. Okay, they're the ones that have had their military gutted. I don't know. I mean, we live in this strange world where if you remember Seinfeld, the comedy show, they had the episode where everything was the opposite. It was
the Bizarro Jerry.
Bizarro. Yeah. Well, this is Bizarro world. This is where, the Republicans, Aslan, Ukraine, the Western media seems to be projecting onto Russia everything that's happening to the Ukrainians. Because the truth about the Russians is that, every military makes mistakes. But what happened at the beginning of this conflict was not a mistake. The conflict was waged not to conquer Kiev, not to conquer Ukraine, but to get the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, something Russia had been striving to do before the conflict. So even when the conflict began, Russia was saying, all we want to do is pressure you to get to the negotiating table. And they did. So the Russians won phase one of the operation. That's what people don't understand. It wasn't a Russian defeat. They got the Ukrainians to the negotiating table. They got them to initial a peace plan, and had NATO not intervened, there would have been peace. So how can anybody sit there and say the Russians have failed, they're weak, etc.? Then Russia had to adapt, and they've adapted today. Today, the reason why that $113 billion didn't succeed in turning the tide is that the Russians are better than the Ukrainians. The Russians are better than NATO. Russia's winning this war, and NATO can't admit it. And so we're going to spend another $100 billion. But the good news on this one, Clayton, is we won't be given the chance to spend $100 billion. Because to spend $100 billion, there has to be a Ukrainian state capable of receiving $100 billion. And I don't think that Ukraine's going to be around much longer. I think Zelensky's on his final legs. His wife just gave an interview today where she said, I don't know if he and the Ukrainian people are going to be seeing eye to eye much longer.
That's why you cancel elections.
That's why he canceled elections, and because he knows what the truth is. But the Ukrainian military, too, you're starting to get mainstream media coming out and just saying there's literally nothing left. They've burned through everything. There's nothing left. Whereas the Russians still have 300,000 uncommitted reserves, trained, organized, ready to rock. There's still some heavy fighting left. There's still going to be a lot of people dying, but the outcome is absolutely guaranteed. Total Russian victory.
Well, that's what I wanted to get you out of here on, which is what Zelensky said the other day, which is he wants to continue this failed counteroffensive through the winter. No plans to stop. So where do you see this going over the next 3 months as we head into, we head into wintertime and snowy conditions? What happens?
Well, I'd like to get in my car and drive to California right now. We're getting sort of cold weather here. I'd like to go to the beach and get a suntan. But my tank only holds so much gas. And as I go across the country, unless I can refill my gas tank, I'm going to run out of gas, and it doesn't matter what I want. The tank that Zelensky has is fueled by men. And he's run out of men. The tank's empty. And unless there's a magic Ukrainian manpower gas station out there where he can refill the gas tank, his vehicle's stuck in the middle of the country. And that's the reality. There aren't enough men in Ukraine capable of sustaining this counteroffensive. To be honest, there's not enough men in Ukraine capable of maintaining a viable defense along the entire line of contact. The Russians are going to start the process of just grinding them down again. And when there's not anybody to replace what they have ground down, the Russians will break through. And that's how this war ends.
I guess I'll get you out of here on this. I said I was already going to get you out of here on something else. But this week we saw this attack on the fleet, the naval fleet, of course, in Sevastopol. I think the Western media thought, Putin's going to respond devastatingly, and perhaps NATO was hoping that Putin would respond devastatingly, do something stupid. What do you think the response is going to be, or will there be any response at all that we would classify as massive on some sort of a television scale that CNN would cover and say, see, we told you?
Well, first of all, let's just start this. Putin doesn't give a damn about CNN. He doesn't give a damn about you. He doesn't give a damn about me. He doesn't give a damn about anybody in the West, what we care, what we want to see, what our expectations are, etc. He's here to win the conflict on terms that are favorable to Russia. What's the one thing Ukraine desperately needs right now? Because we just talked about it. They're out of men. Their counteroffensive is stalled. They got nothing. They need help in the form of military intervention. They need NATO to commit to this fight. What could trigger that? An overreaction by Russia. Russia doing something precipitous. Russia doing something that changes the algorithm of the war. Putin knows this. He's the smartest guy in the room right now. So, yeah, the Ukrainians launched an attack. It's a provocative attack. It used scalp missiles. It used Storm Shadows. Those are the French and British air-launched cruise missiles. Several broke through. I mean, when you have the NATO intelligence telling you what the radar coverage is, telling you where the, what the range models are, where the gaps in the radar cover is, you could program these missiles to go through, and some got through and they hit a building that, frankly speaking, was virtually empty, because in a wartime you don't hang out in the in your normal office. You're down in a war bunker. So they killed, I think, one serviceman on duty, or he's missing. I don't know if they found the body yet, but it's embarrassing. Let's be straight up honest. It's embarrassing for the Russians, but they're not going to overreact. At the appropriate time, you will see the Russians take out a decision-making center. Now, they're not going to do it in a way, I don't believe they're going to do it in a way that's designed to, generate the ideal CNN image. They're going to do it in a time when it brings about the maximum harm to the Ukrainians. They're going to wait until people are together, they've located them, and then they're going to hit them and they're going to kill them all. And then the Russians won't say anything about it. It'll be done. Russia's not playing to the West. That's why the West doesn't understand what Russia's doing, because, we're used to, drama. We're used to people projecting something. It's like a Hollywood movie. We have a trailer. I mean, why did Zaluzhny in December give an interview to The Economist saying straight up how many forces he needed? So the Russians went, that's about 9 to 12 brigades. Thank you very much, Zaluzhny. And we're going to go to Melitopol. That means you have to go through Robotyno, Tokmak. So then the Russians went, well, thank you. Now we know exactly what your force structure is, and we know exactly what your axis of advance is. So we're going to build the world's strongest defenses between point A and point B, which they did. They brought in the master of defense, Lieutenant General Alexander Romanchuk, the man who wrote Russian defense doctrine. He built these defenses, and the Ukrainians can't even dent it. See, that's stupidity in the extreme. There was no element of surprise. The Russians knew exactly who was going to attack, where they're going to attack, when they attack, and what their objective was, and they destroyed them, because that's how the West has done this, like a Hollywood movie. We have to play to an audience because the outcome is not what the trailer suggests. And so we have to keep people involved. The Russians, on the other hand, they don't do Hollywood. They'll make their movies after the fact. There'll be soul-searching movies that talk about the horror and trauma of war, but the Russians aren't going to sit there and project what they're doing. They're simply going to win this war, and they're going to win this war in a way that is totally, dismissive of the West's need for drama, for Hollywood-style propaganda. And it's frustrating for people in the West because, we're getting fed all this nonsense from, NATO, from the United States, from the Ukrainians, and we look at the Russians and we're getting nothing. And so the tendency is to fall in on the data you have, but it's totally misleading. And as I said, if I were the Russians, I'd probably be chuckling, because just imagine, you and I are having this great conversation this morning about things that from the Russian perspective just don't matter. They don't care about a GOP video. They don't care about Josh Hawley. They don't care about Zelensky. They don't care about any of it because it no longer matters. The war will be decided on the battlefield. Sergei Lavrov has said this. Putin agrees with him, and that is that, and the West can't handle it. We're talking about a frozen conflict. There will be no frozen conflict. There will be total, unconditional surrender by the Ukrainians to the Russians at a time and choosing of the Russians.
Scott Ritter, it's always great to see you. Thank you so much for your analysis, breaking all of these important pieces down for us. We always appreciate it. Thanks so much for your time, Scott.
Thanks for having me.